In 2009, the film Avatar was released, and the setting was the moon of Pandora, which orbits the gas giant Polyphemus in the Alpha Centauri system. James Cameron tried to use known principles of science for his interstellar craft, and based many aspects of life on Pandora on life on Earth. In this video, we'll look at how accurate the setting really was. Well, first of all, a gas giant in the Alpha Centauri system. Dozens of exoplanets of comparable size to Jupiter and Saturn had been found by 2009, and Alpha Centauri is one of the best studied star systems, being, the closest one to us and all. And had there been a gas giant in it, it would have been detected by the time the film was made. Alpha Centauri is either a binary or trinary star system. Near the center, there are two main stars of comparable luminosity to the Sun spaced 35.6 astronomical units apart. About 0.21 light-years from the center, there's a third smaller star known as Proxima Centauri, and it's uncertain whether this one is orbiting the two in the center, that being A and B, or if it's passing. Hence, we aren't sure if it's a binary or trinary system. But, for the sake of this video, we'll call it binary. Polyphemus is said to orbit the larger of the two stars in the center. When a planet in a binary system is in an S-type orbit, or orbiting one of the stars versus both, there's only so far it can orbit from its parent star until the gravitational influence of the other star flings it off into interstellar space. Basically, each star will have a zone where it can host stable orbits, the size of which will be directly proportional to their mass. Now, it is true that the larger the star, the more luminous it is, but this correlation is nonlinear. Not only will larger stars have bigger cores where the energy is ultimately produced, the greater pressure on top of them means the larger the star, the more energy each kilogram of mass in its core will produce. This means that as the mass of the star increases, the luminosity will increase with increasing marginal returns. As such, the habitable zone, or the distance liquid water could exist on the surface of the planet, will be outside the zone of stable orbits for the larger star, and inside that of the smaller star. So, if there is a habitable planet in the Alpha Centauri system, it would be orbiting the smaller star. As for the orbit of Pandora around Polyphemus, it's said to take 35 hours. This is less than the time Io orbits around Jupiter, and at that distance, tidal heating is so extreme, it turns Io into a volcanic body, with volcanic plumes hundreds of kilometers high. Pandora is said to be more volcanically active than Earth, but if it was as active as Io is, the surface would be a wasteland. Also, we see Polyphemus in the sky at different positions within a 200-kilometer radius. This is a problem because Pandora, like virtually all moons, would be tidally locked to Polyphemus, i.e., it revolves at the same rate it rotates, so one side faces Polyphemus at all times. As a result, Polyphemus would never move in the Pandoran sky at any given location. Now, let's discuss the plausibility and practicality of their interstellar travel system. Avatar falls out of the classic sci-fi trope of faster-than-light travel, and instead utilizes relativistic travel. Here, the starships are filled with deuterium and antideuterium on Earth and accelerated to 70% light speed at 1.5 Gs by a laser battery, which shines a light on a solar sail carried by the ship. The craft then coasts through interstellar space and then uses its matter-antimatter engines to decelerate to a near stop in the Alpha Centauri system. The ship is then refueled with locally harvested deuterium and locally produced antideuterium. Once its tour is done, the ship again uses its antimatter engines to boost up to 70% light speed, coast through interstellar space, and be decelerated by the laser battery as it approaches the solar system. Now, the biggest problem I have with this is the locally produced antideuterium. The reason they did this is because there was no laser battery in the Alpha Centauri system, But producing antimatter is no trivial task either. Since producing an antiparticle also produces a matter particle, it will take 1.8 times 10 to the 17th joules to make 1 kilogram. That's quite a lot, and even if you could use a power source in the system, such as one of the two stars to drive this, it would require a very large facility, which would be very difficult to construct. And what exactly does very difficult mean? Well, it's a relative term, but given that current antimatter production methods are 0.0000001% efficient, while lasers are about 10% efficient, it's safe to say it would be a lot easier to build a laser battery in the Alpha Centauri system. Not only that, if you went with this approach, you'd need less lasers in the solar system to accelerate the starships, or they could carry a greater mass, since they won't be carrying fuel. And of course, there's the inherent risk of carrying antimatter, i.e., if there's a containment breach, the ship will be vaporized with enough energy to sterilize the surface of any Earth-sized planet it's close to. If you insist on using antimatter rocket engines, here's what I'd do. In my video talking about what makes a rocket more quote-unquote efficient, I mentioned that there is a most efficient exhaust velocity, which is about 63% of your desired change in velocity, or delta V. But this is based around Tsiolkovsky's rocket equation, which doesn't work for relativistic speeds. Instead, we have to use this one, where the final velocity is equal to the mass of the starship fueled divided by the mass empty squared minus 1, divided by the same ratio squared plus 1, multiplied by the speed of light. If we plot the final velocity against the energy conversion efficiency, there is no maximum, and instead it approaches 50% as you near the speed of light. What we can instead do is see what a mass ratio of 2 would do. If we plug this value into the equation, we get a top speed of 0.6 c. So, let's say the ship is leaving the Alpha Centauri system, and it's carrying half its empty mass in deuterium and half in antideuterium. It would boost to 60% versus 70% light speed, coast at that speed, and have the laser battery in the solar system slow it down. But wait, didn't I just say that it's doubtful that antimatter could be produced in the Alpha Centauri system? Yes, so instead, the ship could have taken it with it to the Alpha Centauri system and used locally harvested deuterium. However, on the trip there, the antideuterium would be considered part of the payload. So, the ship would be accelerated by a laser battery around the solar system while carrying an additional 75% of its empty weight in antideuterium and another 75% in deuterium, which it would use to decelerate as it approached Alpha Centauri. Because the ship is burning through 1.5 times as much fuel while approaching Alpha Centauri, the deceleration time will also be 1.5 times as long. But what would be a good rate to accelerate at? Let's say 10 meters per second squared, rounded from 9.8 meters per second squared, or 1 g. The speed of light is 300 million meters per second, and 60% of that is 180 million meters per second. However, since we're dealing with relativistic speeds, we have to use the relativistic equation for momentum. This is the mass times the velocity divided by the square root of 1 minus the velocity squared divided by the speed of light squared. This comes out to 225 million kilogram meters per second per kilo. So, at 10 meters per second squared, it will take 22,500,000 seconds to reach 60% light speed. For some perspective, a year is approximately 30 million seconds. Since the approaching decelerating phase will take 1.5 times as long as the accelerating phase, the deceleration phase will take 27 million seconds, while the acceleration phase will take 18 million seconds. To make the outgoing and return trip as long as each other, more of the lasers could accelerate the outgoing craft at a greater rate, while fewer are used to decelerate the incoming craft in the solar system. Since, in this scenario, the ships will spend 1.5 years accelerating and decelerating, and their average speed during this time will be 0.3 c. They will cover 0.45 light years during this period. Alpha Centauri is 4.36 light years away, which leaves a distance of roughly 3.9 light years to coast. At 60% light speed, this will take 6.5 years, and since 1.5 years are spent accelerating and decelerating, the total journey time will be 8 years as opposed to 6. Another issue is the use of deuterium-antideuterium itself. When fundamental particles like quarks or leptons, which includes electrons, collide with their corresponding antiparticle, their constituent mass is turned into energy in the form of a photon pair. However, when protons and neutrons collide with their antimatter counterparts, they produce mesons, with one being positively charged, the second being negatively charged, and the third being neutral. This neutral one is a problem, since it can't be directed via a magnetic field and will end up damaging the engine. Although, one way to circumvent this problem might be to somehow split the protons into their constituent quarks and annihilate those. As to how the momentum from the gamma rays could be used, well, they could have the photon hit a particle, which will take its momentum, while the remaining energy of the photon is turned into a particle-antiparticle pair. The larger particle is then looped around via a magnetic field, transferring its momentum to the craft, and collided with another antiparticle. Meanwhile, the smaller particle-antiparticle pair are annihilated. The photons from these annihilations are used to strike other particles, and thus the cycle repeats. So, there's a conceivable mechanism for an antimatter starship, but how much energy would it require? Well, if a starship had enough matter-antimatter fuel to boost to 70% light speed, it would have a full-to-empty ratio of 2.38. If the craft had an empty mass of 1,000 metric tons, it would burn through 1,380 tons of matter-antimatter fuel, which would have a total energy of 1.24 times 10 to the 23rd joules. This acceleration and deceleration occurs over the course of 14 million seconds, which gives a power output of 8.87 petawatts. For some perspective, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima went off at 65 terajoules, so that would be like 68 of those going off in each engine every second. Think of a Gatling gun that fires so rapidly that you just hear a hum, but each bullet is a Hiroshima bomb. It's quite an engineering challenge to make an engine that could cope with this, but another problem was the Starship and Avatar had the payload and engines arranged in a tractor configuration. This was apparently to use the mass-saving advantages of a tensile structure, but if you're using antimatter fuel at a rate high enough for a high G acceleration, the exhaust plume would be so powerful that any stray photons would vaporize anything behind the nozzle. The quote-unquote sole reason that humans are in Pandora is to mine unobtainium. Despite the name, unobtainium isn't an element, but a compound, and it's a room temperature superconductor. Whether or not room temperature superconductors are possible is an open question. In the lore, humans need unobtainium to avert an energy crisis on Earth, and an issue brought up by Spacedock is if humans can produce enough energy to power relativistic starships, how could they be suffering from an energy crisis at the same time? This just doesn't add up. Well, it may be that the problem isn't so much producing the energy, but distributing it to everyone on Earth. This would especially be true if the infrastructure that powers the interstellar fleet was close to the Sun or on Mercury. But I think there's another problem with this backstory. Why can't humans make unobtainium themselves? Supposedly, the unobtainium was initially produced when Pandora was a molten protoplanet by a combination of the high temperatures and pressures in the interior and the magnetic fields produced by Polyphemus. While such conditions may be difficult to replicate, for every shipment of unobtainium brought back to the solar system, it will take a dozen or two of its mass energy equivalents in energy to do so. Any chemical we can find we can synthesize. Sure, some production methods are very inefficient, leaving much to be desired, and hopefully, in the near future, we'll develop new technologies that can more efficiently produce them. But they don't require anything close to their mass energy equivalent in material to be produced. As such, it's hard to see how shipping a Hia from Alpha Centauri is the easier way to obtain unobtainium. Although, there are conflicting sources in the lore which state that it includes the element unbenillium. Unbenillium is an element that is hypothesized to exist that has 120 protons. The heaviest element ever synthesized, oganesson, has 118 protons, and is the heaviest element possible in accordance with the conventional laws of nuclear physics. But even then, this element is very unstable, having a half-life of only 0.89 milliseconds. However, it's been proposed that just beyond this, there is an island of stability where elements with a similar atomic mass don't decompose. If unbenillium was produced by an as-of-yet undescribed cosmochemical process and was an integral component of unobtainium, it would make mining it on Pandora and transporting it back an economically practical strategy because humans might not know how to produce unbenillium to incorporate it into unobtainium. Although, if this was the case, it would still make more economic sense to refine the unbenillium out of the unobtainium, transport it back to the solar system, and make the unobtainium on Earth, because that would cut down the payload mass a lot. Now, onto the ecology and organismal biology of Pandora. One feature of most Pandoran multicellular organisms is the ability to share thoughts via their qi, which they can link together. Are such structures biologically possible? Well, supposedly they can use it to share information about their thoughts and experience. Now, if you look at their anatomy, you can see nerves going from their brain down to their qi. In order to share sensory information stored as memory, the qi nerve would have to have nerves homologous with ones analogous to the optic, olfactory, auditory nerves, etc. Alterations to the Hox genes in animals can cause limbs to grow in other places. So, it's possible some mutation caused the nerves to grow in the qi in the distant ancestor of the Na'vi, and most other Pandoran fauna. Now, in order to convey this information from one to another, the qi nerve would have to have some kind of synapse where they would meet for the signal to go from one to the other, and it would have to meet the same nerve cell in the Na'vi that the individual is engaging in Sahelu with. Having exposed nerve cells, even if they're covered most of the time, will be difficult because they're quite delicate, and over a short time they will become damaged. One way to circumvent this would be to have a thin membrane and a tiny muscle over the synapse. While engaging in Sahelu, when the terminal nerve ending gets an impulse, the muscle will contract, and a mechanical sensing nerve ending over the terminal nerve in the other Na'vi will detect this contraction and cause its corresponding terminal nerve to fire. Using this mechanism, the Na'vi could convey information to each other via their qi. Now, one problem with this is that the interface between the terminal nerves of the qi will have a much larger cross-section than the nerves themselves, and thus the qi will have to have a larger cross-section than the qi stem. But, if you look at it, their qi is composed of many qi tentacle-like appendages, which can be used to increase the surface area, and thus convey information. But, how would such a system come about in the first place? If I were to come up with a scenario where this would be possible, I'd say it began shortly after multicellularity evolved in Pandoran life. It likely started with colonial organisms that had synapses which conveyed very simple information to each other, forming a hive mind. As the individual organisms evolved greater and greater intelligence, the protoquis would accordingly evolve the ability to convey greater and greater levels of information. But here's a problem. While the ancestor of most Pandoran multicellular life forms may have been social, if any evolved a solitary lifestyle, as we see some Pandoran species have, their qi would become almost useless, and there would be selective pressure to lose it. You can think of it like subterranean animals losing their eyes. Without a utility, both the eyes and the qi would simply be a vulnerability. Once it's gone, it's unlikely to be able to re-evolve. This means the Pandoran quote-unquote animals with a qui probably were social since their ancestors were on a level of complexity between a jellyfish and nematode worm. And remember, most social animals on Earth evolved from solitary ancestors, so in all probability, such a feature would be weeded out in all species. Although, to be fair, having the ability to directly share information via the protoqui could make social behavior a more evolutionarily favorable strategy than it is on Earth. As different species diverge from a common ancestor, alterations to the qui nerve endings would build up, making it more difficult to transmit information. So, it may be that when the Na'vi engage in Sahelu with dire horses or banshees, they can only convey basic information, such as commands, which is what we see. However, they shouldn't have been able to exchange visual information with the Tolkun. The plant-like life on Pandora also have neural interfaces. Now, you could ask, how could they be compatible with that of the Na'vi? One way I could think of is that instead of evolving multicellularity independently, they also evolved from the primitive ancestor of the Na'vi, who had a jellyfish to nematode level of complexity. Once the ancestor had developed a basic level of sensory perception and cognition, some had become secondarily simplified, evolving into something like a coral. Corals have algal symbionts which produce food for them via photosynthesis. So, it may be the distant ancestor of the Pandoran flora engulfed algal-like symbionts in a similar manner. They first formed reefs, like the ones we see in Avatar: The Way of Water, and then they colonized the land. Later, they would grow in forests, but not forests as we understand them, but a social unit of different organisms interacting with each other via nerve connections in their roots. You can think of it like something between a forest and a superorganism. Think like Pando, the aspen grove in Colorado, and the Malheur forest mycelium in Oregon. These forest colonies on Pandora could form social units much larger than the aforementioned superorganisms. But could they form a planet-wide network, where all, or at least all multicellular life, is interconnected? Well, for it to form a Hivemind, the descendants of the first Pandoran quote-unquote animal, which had basic sensory and cognitive abilities, would have to remain in contact with each other. On Earth, when two populations speciate, it's usually because they became separated by a geographic barrier, but there is also sympatric speciation, or where they do so in proximity to each other. This usually results from a niche in the environment opening up that some of the species occupy. On Pandora, perhaps this early multicellular pioneer sympatrically speciated with the two descendants forming a symbiotic relationship. The sympatric speciation continued further, until you had a Hivemind symbiotic community, the descendants of which gave rise to the Pandoran flora and fauna. We often observe symbiotic relationships in nature, but to form a global network, this Hivemind community of organisms would have to spread outward, with interactions not being impeded by geographic barriers. Given what we've seen in Earth's history, this is incredibly unlikely, because things like freak volcanic events can separate populations, resulting in genetic divergence and ultimately speciation. Once the descendant Hivemind communities come into contact with each other, they will in all likelihood compete versus cooperate. It is possible they could form a mutualistic relationship upon reconnecting, but this is unlikely, since under most circumstances, individual selection outweighs group selection. All this to say that it's pretty doubtful that a planet-wide Hivemind could form. Even if a global Hivemind did form, it wouldn't have any need for nexus points like the Tree of Souls or the Tree of Voices. You might argue that in most eusocial organisms which form Hiveminds, there is often a queen, but the queen isn't a queen as we understand it, i.e., she isn't the leader of the colony, she's merely the caste who produces offspring, and decision-making is done collectively through all members of the Hivemind. Now, onto the plausibility of the plants and animals of Pandora themselves. One thing that is noteworthy is that many of them are larger than their earthly counterparts. Take the hammerhead titanothere, which is like a Pandoran rhino/elephant. Its height is given at 6.5 meters, its length is 11 meters, and its mass is given at 11 tons, quote-unquote twice that of the elephant. This doesn't make too much sense because the average height of a male Asian elephant is about 2.8 meters at the shoulder, and it weighs around 4 tons. So, if we divide 6.5 by 2.8 and raise it to the power of 3, we get that the hammerhead titanothere should be 12.5 times more massive and thus weigh 50 tons, i.e., they're closer in size to sauropod dinosaurs. Now, perhaps the same rules of body density don't apply, but looking at how the titanotheres can crush everything in their path when they charge, this doesn't seem to be the case. And there is another possible issue: an animal that large charging. A mechanical modeling experiment showed that large sauropods could only move at around 2 meters per second before their bones would snap from the pressures involved. Although, it was stated that the Navi have bones reinforced with a naturally occurring carbon fiber, so it may be that most other Pandoran fauna have similar skeletons that could withstand the stress. Fundamental differences in anatomy and physiology can give separate clades of organisms different limits. On top of that, the acceleration due to gravity on Pandora is 80% that of the Earth. As the gravity decreases, the maximum mass of a land animal will increase as a function of the change cubed. This is because the mass is limited by the square cube law. As a single dimension increases, the mass will increase as a function of the change cubed, while the cross-section of the support structure increases as a function of the change squared. Basically, the cross-section increases slower than the mass, so eventually it snaps from the weight above it. But, as you decrease the gravity, the load that each square centimeter of the support structure will have to hold up will decrease in a linear relationship with the change in gravity. So, if you halve the gravity, you can double the dimensions and thus increase the mass 8-fold. Pandora's gravity is 80% that of Earth, so if an animal on Earth was transported to Pandora, each square centimeter of its skeleton will experience 51% less of the strain than it will on Earth. This means the skeletal strain a hammerhead titanothere would experience would be comparable to a 26-ton animal here on Earth. Also, while an animal the size of a titanothere may not die from breaking its own bones from running, overheating would likely be a problem for an animal that size exerting itself because of the same square cube law, and it would probably need a structure like a sail to dissipate heat. Not only are the animals on Pandora massive, so are the plants. On Earth, the largest tree, Hyperion, is 116 meters tall, and what's believed to limit the height of trees on Earth is capillary action. If you put a straw in a glass full of water, you can see some of the water in the straw raising above the surrounding water. This is because hydrogen bonding between the water molecules and the inner surface of the straw keeps them bound to the surface. The total strength of the interaction is a function of the area of the straw coming in contact with the water, while the counteracting gravitational force is a function of the volume of water within the straw. So, we're back to the square cube law. At smaller radii, the stronger the bonding is pulling the water up relative to the strength of gravity pulling it down. To transport water up, plants have capillaries which are made of the cell walls of dead cells in what's known as the xylem. It's above around 125 meters that gravity will overcome the capillary action, and being unable to deliver water to their leaves above this height, plants cannot grow any taller than this. Pandora's gravity is 80% that of the Earth, but the largest trees are over 500 meters high. Basically, the lower gravity cannot explain how trees could grow this high. One way around this is that instead of making the capillaries from hollowed out cells, Pandoran trees have organelles within their cells which transport the water. These would be much smaller than the capillaries used in earthly plants, allowing Pandoran trees to grow much taller. The Pandoran nights are illuminated by the bioluminescent glow of pretty much all organisms in the environment. However, this seems pretty unlikely since bioluminescence is energetically expensive. Organisms who utilize it do so for reasons such as communication or luring prey. Very few organisms glow constantly, because doing this will not only cost energy, but it will make them easier for a predator to spot. So, it's hard to imagine a reason that being constantly luminous in the dark wouldn't be selected against. The next issue is the degree of convergent evolution that exists between Pandoran and earthly organisms. While not unrealistic that they would evolve similar shapes, like the humanoid shape of the Na'vi, what's unrealistic is that they would have convergently evolved the same facial features to convey emotions. That would be like two languages convergently evolving to be mutually intelligible. Another issue that's kind of in the gray area is the Na'vi having human voices. If you listen to ravens on YouTube, you can hear that they often mimic speech with a human voice. And this isn't simply them perfectly mimicking their owner's voice. The bird has its own distinct voice. What's even freakier is that they can switch between male and female voices. Birds and mammals evolved separate structures to produce complex vocalizations. So if one of them could evolve a human voice, it's in the realm of possibility that an extraterrestrial organism could do the same. However, another thing featured in the movie which is completely unrealistic is the Tree of Souls interfacing with Grace and Jake's nervous system. In order for this to be realistic, life on Pandora and Earth would have to evolve the same neurotransmitters convergently, and there's no way this happened. Quaritch also stated that the Na'vi use arrows dipped in a neurotoxin that will stop your heart in 1 minute. And for this to work, again, Pandoran life would have to use the same neurotransmitters that Terran life does. And this is again impossible. Another problem with neurology is Jake being the only one who can use his brother's avatar because of their identical DNA. In order for the human operator to control an avatar, the link machine would have to read the parts of their brain responsible for motor control, and these are in the same region in every person. So, he shouldn't need identical DNA to operate the avatar. And even if they needed the same brain structures, differences in life experience can cause brains to develop differently. Needless to say, Jake, who went into the military, and Tom, who went into academia, had very different life experiences. So, if the same brain is required for remote control, Jake still shouldn't have been able to use it. Although, maybe the scenario could work if they scanned Jake's brain and had the avatar's brain develop in a similar manner on the flight to Pandora. The link machines themselves supposedly transfers the consciousness of the person from their human body into their avatar body. So, they're basically in a vegetative state while in there using the avatar. But, in order for this to work, the avatar would have to be in a machine when the transfer takes place, and because his consciousness is with his avatar, Quaritch shouldn't have been able to sever the link between Jake and his avatar by turning off the machine, because there wouldn't be a link. Also, if the machine transfers consciousness, Jake could have just used that to fully transfer into his avatar body at the end of the first movie. It would make more sense for the avatar operators to have a head jack, kind of like the ones in the Matrix, surgically implanted, which could read neuromotor information coming from the brain going down the spinal cord. This would then be transferred to a radio receiver in the avatar's head jack to make it move. The head jack of the avatar would also receive sensory information and relay it to the head jack of the human operator. That method would be consistent with what we see in the movies. The last issue I have isn't so much about the scientific accuracy, but military tactics. During the attack on the Tree of Souls, why did Quaritch deploy ground troops for an air raid? That's just needlessly putting men in danger. While visually stunning, Avatar science seems to make sense on the surface, but falls apart under closer scrutiny, and would thus be better described as science fantasy than science fiction.